Hello, everybody. Welcome back for our last uh, big content week, since our last week will be kind of closing out the course and bringing everything back together now that we've covered all these different revolutions. So, we're on our last set of revolutions here, um, and it's a little bit different for us than what we have been doing the last several weeks because we have been able to do a singular revolution within a week, right? We've done American, we've done French, and we've done Haitian. And for this particular week, we are including a bunch of different wars for independence into one single week, which is the way that Klooster has arranged it. But it's also the revolutions that we are probably the least familiar with. So it does make it a little bit more difficult for us in terms of being able to place everything that we want to know for this particular week, I think. So that being said, you already know by this point in the semester we don't have anything like quizzes that are asking you to, really specifically hone in on certain dates or figures or, events necessarily in the timeline of the revolution itself. And so the same thing will be true today. We're going to focus in on some certain themes that are particularly important to understanding the revolutions in Latin America, but don't feel like you have to really bog yourself down on some of the specifics here, because in a condensed class like this, it's just very, very difficult to do. So we are going to use this lecture to help us conceptualize how we should be thinking about these revolutions in particular. So, first and foremost, we want to get a sense of what's going on in Latin America and what we're considering the region to be, right? So, technically, we could put Haiti in the world of Latin America, but we are leaving it with the French, and that's why we're technically calling this the Spanish revolutions. As we know in the case of Brazil, not necessarily all. Colonial enterprises of Spain, right? We've got Portugal in the mix as well. But one of the things that we want to see from this particular map, right, is that we've got the evolution within Latin America that pretty much every political entity within Latin America, aside from Cuba and Puerto Rico, are going to attain independence in this particular time period. And so we've got this massive movement, right, of independence from the Spanish Empire, which Klooster gives you quite a bit of information in terms of the background of why this is happening. We want to use the same questions that we've used for some of our other revolutions to really just make sure that we're understanding the key components of what's going on in this particular context, so we understand why all of these things are happening at the time that they're happening. So when we're looking at Spanish Latin America in the sections that the empire is essentially divided into within the colonies, this is providing you a bit of a visual in terms of making sure that you understand where all of these things are, right? You've got these four viceroyalties that exist throughout Latin America. This is true going back to the origins of the colonial enterprise. Spain's territorial ownership is very, very vast, right? It's vast in a way in terms of land ownership and number of people that none of the other empires really ever attain in the Americas, right? If we think about the French, who had kind of a series of colonies around, following the Mississippi, going, up into Canada, or we look at the Dutch, who really didn't ever take on any sizable amount of land in the Americas, and then the English, who expand their territory over time. And if we consider, like, the Canadian Arctic is a vast amount of land, but in terms of numbers of people, Spain has always had just this massive, massive amount of people that it has to manage as it grows, right, throughout this region. And it's got all of this ecological diversity, all of this cultural and social diversity, and also because of the unique conditions of colonial development in the Spanish Empire, right? There's a key difference which is really important to understanding the revolutions in these colonial entities in comparison to, say, the American Revolution, which is quite a bit of racial intermixing throughout these regions, right? So you've got, initially, um, primarily just single men, right, who are going out in engaging in the extraction of resources, which Spain, right, because they're ahead of the game in terms of colonial enterprises, if we go further back into the past, really gets to take over areas that have a lot of natural resources for extraction. Klooster will mention, right, the continued relevance of something like silver for the Spanish colonies even after all of these revolutions have completed. So, because there's all of these resources available, the goals of Spain, right? You heard the phrase glory, God, and gold, right? Create a certain type of structure that doesn't exist in the English colonies to engage in more racial intermixing, incorporation of the Native American population or the Indian population that lives in these areas, whereas in the British colonies, right, there's quite a bit of separation between the English colonists and the Native American peoples. So we've already talked about how that plays out in terms of what happens in the American Revolution, but because they've been incorporated into their economic and social systems in Spain in ways that they have not in England or the British colonies, then the social conditions are very different. And so this is where we get this um, essentially a very solidified idea of a racial hierarchy that is embedded into many of these cultures, but manifests in different ways depending on what region of the Spanish Empire or Spanish colonies we're looking at, right? Which Klooster does go in a bit on, and the particular conditions, say, of the Andes, right, and the economic sort of geographic structure versus, what's going on in New Spain. Either way, right, this kind of idea of purity of blood within Spanish society is not necessarily unique to the colonies. It has its origins in Moorish Spain, right, the Reconquista and everything that is happening in Europe after, the Islamic control and the Crusades and all of that stuff. But its manifestation in the colonies is unique because it is much more clearly tied to race. You've got all of these different types of people who are interacting in this space, and the longer you've got the development of a colonial society, the more and more distinct it becomes, right? So the general hierarchy that you want to get a sense of in terms of how this is playing out once you're getting into like what's going on in each revolution on the ground, right, is you've got, as Klooster mentions, the Peninsulares, the people who are born in Spain, right, even if they come to the New World or return back to Spain, they are considered to be kind of at the top of this hierarchy. Underneath them, which is the entity that we can see most similarly in terms of making maybe some sort of equal comparison to some of the planter class when we look at Haiti or we look at some of the elites that formed the foundation of the founding fathers in the United States, which is the Creole class, right? So you've got the people who are Spanish blood, right? They are fully Spanish in terms of their racial makeup, or at least they're understood to be, and they are born in the Americas, right? And as Klooster will also note, there is a lot of political social tension between them and the Peninsulares. But then you've got everybody else that is also existing in this space, of which there are also a variety of interior sort of hierarchies built in here, right? Because the legal system is creating a very solid idea of where somebody fits in this racial hierarchy. So you've got all of this different types of mixed groups. You've got singular sort of races that are individually seen as lesser than white, right? So you're talking about like people who are fully indigenous or fully African slave. And one of the issues, right, because of the racial intermixing is where we view different people on the social hierarchy and where they see themselves in the larger social and economic structure. And so we've got all of this kind of uniqueness to Latin America that doesn't necessarily exist in some of the other regions that we've covered up to this point. And this is a key component of understanding what the revolutionaries are trying to achieve once these revolutions start gearing up, because we will see the involvement of, say, Enlightenment ideas and principles. But when we look at some of the leaders of these movements, they will very specifically say, we are not like these other areas. There are certain concerns that we have tied to our existence and our development that make it impossible for us to be a France or for us to be a United States. And we will see, in these readings how this plays out exactly. If we're looking at our other sort of key question here, um, you know, what's leading to revolution? This is the same question that we asked for France and some of the other revolutions we've done up to this point, as well as how successful is it. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I did want to just kind of give you a visualization here and lay out the kind of key points so you make sure you're understanding them from Klooster, because this is something we're less familiar with, right? Because Spain is so large, so unwieldy, it is so diverse, and then on top of it, you've got all of this kind of management, governance issues that are happening, not unlike what we see. I think Klooster does make this direct comparison to the American colonies and the concept of salutary neglect, right? There's this period of time in which the Spanish colonies take over more of their own governance, but they don't have the same sort of representative entities that the American colonies did, right? They didn't have like a house of burgesses per se. They've got this more hierarchical structure, which Klooster lays out for you in terms of coming from the crown and making its way downwards to the local level. But because they've got this sort of chaotic relationship that is then tried to be improved on with the Bourbon reforms, right? Then essentially these conditions sort of open the door to the idea of independence. But in addition, right, one of the things that Klooster emphasizes, and pretty much all sources do on this particular issue, is international implications that really open the door towards this fight for independence, which is Napoleon, right? So once Napoleon imprisons Ferdinand and it kind of throws Spain into chaos, right? You've got this whole drama that plays out in Klooster on the Cortes de Cadiz, which is, what do we do once the king is gone? How does the governance in Spain operate? And where do the colonies see their loyalties lie, right? Is it with the king? Is it with the entity of Spain? Right? Do they feel like they're being well represented in this new style of governance? And what's interesting about it, right, is both the Bourbon reforms and the Cortes of Cadiz are in some ways modeled or inspired by Enlightenment ideals. So we've got an interesting sort of dynamic going on here, because as we'll see here in a second, revolutionaries are also inspired by Enlightenment ideals, but this is the sort of conditions that come to the forefront that if the mother country is in chaos, if it isn't really functioning well prior to this point, right, it's kind of fallen off of its peak that had been in centuries prior, then you've got a growing amount of interest by people within the colonies to self-governance and moving away from this imperial control. And even by the time Ferdinand comes back to power, right, all of these things have already been set in motion by this point. So, do we think that this is successful or not? This is the reason for why I've included this additional source from Jeremy Adelson, because the common narrative when we think about the Latin American revolutions and the way that we tend to think about Latin America, even into the present, is that they were fundamentally, in many ways, a failure, because they threw Latin America into political chaos from which it has never recovered. That there is just always this undercurrent of unrest, of revolution, of coup, and new, authoritarian regimes. And so we want to get a sense of what do we feel like the legacy is of these revolutions, and where do we see them impacting and giving ourselves a more complex story than maybe our surface level understanding of them are. And it's interesting because this is tied to the second question for discussion this week, is how all of these revolutionary figures get tied up into the narrative that exists in the history of Latin America. But this is giving you the general layout, right, of the ways in which the leaders of the time period focused on trying to achieve control, right? You've got the Creole class who is doing similar stuff to what we've seen in some of these other revolutions. It's about sovereignty, right, more than it is about necessarily like democracy within society. And then you've got all of these other components because of the diversity of the region. And so there are these attempts at creating a solidified, unified sort of governing system over Latin America. Somebody like Bolivar is invested in that principle, but because the area is so diverse, it's difficult to attain that, and because everybody's got all these competing interests in terms of why they're supporting the revolution. It's very difficult to maintain any sort of unified governing entity by the time it's over, and this is where we get into the end sort of result of the revolution, which is, as Klooster notes, the kind of creation of a very heavily, tightly controlled military-like regime, right, where you've got these warlords that essentially come into power and run some of these states in a dictatorial way, essentially. But we're gonna talk about this because I think it's important for thinking about that second question about the position of leaders and what revolutionary figures represented at the time and what we continue to view them as, which we can also expand outward to other revolutionary leaders in other countries that we've covered up to this point. So if we look at this concept of the Enlightenment, because the chapter in Klooster doesn't necessarily talk as much about the Enlightenment, and it's been a question that we've been asking ourselves throughout the semesters. How are these ideas sort of disseminated into these different populations? The podcast talked about, right, Haiti, like a non-literate population, and how that would have made its way into the public's understanding. So we're also interested in how this happens in Latin America. It is helped along by the Bourbon reforms, right? The Bourbon reforms have certain ideas tied to the Enlightenment that are intertwined with the sort of actions that are being taken by this new type of governance. And they're also opening up the amount of information and product that can be disseminated into the colonies, right? If you remember, it creates a more liberal, I guess we could say, trading agreement within the colonies, and also is not as oppressive as previous regimes were in terms of what type of information could be made available to colonists. And so more and more people become aware of the ideas of the Enlightenment. But at the same time, some of the people who are involved in the spreading of Enlightenment ideas in the Latin American colonies run into conflict with the Bourbon reforms, and also maybe on some level seem in contradiction to the Enlightenment itself. And they are religious figures that tended to spread a lot of these ideas because, as Klooster notes, the Jesuits, who ran a lot of the educational institutions, were in some cases leaders of revolutionary movements within Latin America themselves, were sharing these ideas to these upper classes, the people who were able to be educated. And yet the Bourbon reforms essentially tried to get rid of the Jesuits, right? So this creates a tension within the region as well. We also can't, right, forget the degree to which, by this point, People within Latin America were aware of the other revolutions that we've covered up to this point, not unlike what we see with Edmund Burke. You look at certain figures in Latin American revolutionary movements, like we see with these upper classes who are involved in promoting these ideas, that there are certain things that they view as positive in terms of revolutionary effort, like the American Revolution, which had a relatively low amount of bloodshed and chaos in comparison to the French Revolution, which became more and more radical over time. So if you see this quote from Miranda, right, one of the key revolutionary figures in Latin America, he's basically saying, we don't want to be France. And so we know that those sorts of conversations are happening amongst revolutionary leaders and people within the colonies, generally speaking. The other condition, if we're getting to like the question of what makes the Spanish Americas unique, is that because there are Enlightenment ideas built into the Bourbon reforms, also built into the Cortes itself, yet the fundamental debate and end result of the Cortes, right, once you read Klooster, is that the Peninsulares don't budge an inch, right, really, on giving the colonists more power or more representation in the government, then the Enlightenment principles in of themselves don't achieve anything. And this is something that Bolivar is really invested in. Like, what are we trying to achieve liberty for? There has to be an end goal at, you know, when you reach the finish line. And so their primary goal is emancipation, right? But to achieve emancipation with the particular conditions that exist in Latin America, in which there isn't necessarily the same sort of foundational elements that we see in North America, right? Then this is what helps push the style of governance much more strongly towards a very strong governing system to maintain stability, right? It's that same question that we've come back to throughout this semester, which is all of these ideological concerns are really great, but everybody really wants stability in their own lives. They want economic opportunity. They want, better lives for themselves and their children. And so these are the questions that are seeking to be answered in this sort of process as well. And so a strong government helps provide that stability in the view of these revolutionary leaders, right? But we do know, definitely, we look at somebody like Bolivar in this quote, they're definitely aware in conversation with, right, all of these Enlightenment ideas and principles were well read in many Enlightenment thinkers, and those ideas were also disseminated out to the larger populace at the time. I'm going to end here on the concept of the liberator because this is the second question that you're being asked. You may have heard of some of these figures before. If you have not heard of any of them, then I put this in a side note in the readings. I don't want to give you a bunch of readings to do because you already have enough. And so I don't want to, make it feel overwhelming for you. I did include a short Time article that is an interview with an author who wrote a recent biography on Bolivar. But there are certain figures, just like there are in any other revolutionary movement in the Age of Revolutions, that are well known throughout Latin America. And because figures like Bolivar went throughout the region and fought for liberation, then they've got this kind of larger than life position and that still exists in these regions in the present. And it's because we haven't really talked about this question yet. I thought this last week here, where we're talking about particular revolutions, is a good time to ask it, especially because in the case of a figure like Bolivar, have almost become controversial in a way because they have been taken on so heavily by the state, right? Hugo Chavez in Venezuela really like taking on the imagery of Bolivar and tying it to more recent political conditions. But like the founding fathers, right? Latin American revolutionaries are key figures in the identity of Latin America and the kind of uniqueness of what it is to be American. And what I mean by American is we're talking about Latin American, which is not usually the way that we use the term American, but it goes back to some of these yeah, identifying features of the mestizaje, right? Like this idea of a diverse, intermixed populace with the unique conditions of living in this particular region. Um, what's interesting, right, about these liberating figures, right, is they are for the most part all Creoles. So they are not necessarily themselves figures who were represented, right, in this particular intermixed world. But they are, in most cases, influenced, right, by these Enlightenment ideas, influenced in different ways, representative of the liberation of Latin American peoples and the independence and the creation of an unique Latin American identity. We can also come back to that question of what we saw in the case of France, helping in the development of certain ideas of nationalism as well, right? Because we don't end up with a unified Latin America at the end of the day. So it's interesting to think about. Klooster is not really going to get into the legacy of these figures, but he will talk about what's going on specifically regarding these figures um, in the larger narrative of these revolutions. I've also given you the other source if you're somebody who's more of a visual learner, because we haven't done a lot of visual stuff this semester, the ways in which they've been depicted in art. So if you look at the source, you may think it's kind of long. It's got a lot of pictures in it. I promise. So we can get a sense of how these figures became so iconic in this larger narrative of liberation, and what we can gain from looking at these figures themselves in relation to this kind of larger trajectory in the creation of this unique identity. So, on that note, I'm going to leave us here for this week. I will see you back here for our last week, where we bring everything back together and think back on our initial themes.